There's a specific move in this hearing that I think is actually one of the more interesting pieces of questioning technique in this entire saga, and it's worth understanding exactly why it works the way it does. Representative Deborah Ross doesn't come in with a new accusation. She comes in with Patel's own written words, his own confirmation hearing language submitted to the Senate months earlier, and she just reads it back to him. Then asks him to apply his own standard to a series of specific scenarios. That's a genuinely different kind of pressure than most of what we've covered on this channel. It's not, did you do something wrong? It's, here's the test you wrote for yourself. Does this pass it? 60 minutes today. Let's go through the whole thing properly. Fast version. This is Ross questioning Patel in a House hearing, and she opens by directly quoting his written Senate questionnaire language, the same language we've referenced across several previous episodes, and his verbal commitment about no retributive action. What makes this hearing distinct is the structure. Rather than asking abstract questions about intent, she builds a series of concrete hypotheticals and asks him to categorize each one using his own stated standard. The actual promise, restated one more time, precisely. Worth restating the exact language because everything in this hearing gets measured against it. In his written responses to the Senate questionnaire, personnel decisions shall be based on performance and adherence to the law, and every FBI employee will be held to the absolute same standard, and no one will be terminated for case assignments. Verbally, under oath, there will be no politicization at the FBI. There will be no retributive actions taken by the FBI should I be confirmed. No qualifiers in either version. That's the baseline everything today gets tested against. The first hypothetical, and the answer that starts sliding Ross's first question, would hiring FBI agents, analysts, and supervisors from only one political party count as politicization or as legitimate, merit-based personnel decisions? Patel's answer: we don't ask FBI people applicants where their political parties are. That's worth noting precisely the question asked about a hiring pattern being politically skewed. The answer given is about a specific practice not existing. Those are related but not identical claims. Ross follows up directly, asking whether Patel personally asks FBI applicants who they voted for. The transcript shows an answer beginning, "We, the FBI, does not," before shifting into a different formulation. We've covered this exact moment before, and worth restating the honest read on it. A corrected pronoun mid-sentence in live testimony is an extremely common human speech pattern. On its own, it doesn't establish anything about actual hiring practices. It's worth noting mainly because Ross herself treats it as meaningful in the moment, not because the linguistic slip itself proves anything. The direct factual claim, people have been asked. Here's where the exchange moves from hypothetical to something more concrete. Ross states directly, as an assertion rather than a question, in fact, people have been asked who they voted for. Not a hypothetical anymore, a direct factual claim. She connects this immediately to the Driscoll lawsuit, stating that during interviews for the acting director role, before Patel was even confirmed, transition officials reportedly asked Driscoll which candidates he'd voted for in each of the last 5 elections, and that he refused to answer. This is worth being precise about. Patel's testimony, in the material available to us, doesn't include a direct rebuttal of this specific 5-election claim. The broader hearing moves toward disputing whether the resulting terminations were retaliatory, rather than specifically disputing whether the voting questions themselves were ever asked during that interview process. Those are genuinely 2 different factual questions. Were these questions asked? And were the firings retaliatory? And the available testimony addresses the second one much more directly than the first. The Driscoll details, laid out fully one more time. Worth restating the Driscoll background properly here, since this hearing puts it in sharper focus than some others. Nearly 20 years at the Bureau, led the Critical Incident Response Group, held a Medal of Valor, served as acting director during the transition period before Patel was confirmed. His termination letter, according to testimony across multiple hearings, cites Article 2 of the Constitution as its authority. language Ross herself flags directly, noting accurately that Article 2 vests executive power in the president, not the FBI director. Patel's response, when asked under what authority he invoked it, quote, "That matter is under litigation and I'm not able to discuss it," end quote. Standard legal non-answer for active litigation. Doesn't confirm the letter's exact wording, doesn't dispute it. If accurately described, it remains exactly the kind of specific legal detail a court is going to examine directly, separate from any political noise around the broader dispute. The Stephen Miller thread. From this same hearing, Ross also raises the Stephen Miller conversations directly in this exchange, asking how often Patel speaks with him and whether Miller has ever offered opinions on how to run the FBI specifically. Patel confirms frequent contact, describes it as connected to Homeland Security task forces, and when pressed on whether that extends into internal FBI management specifically, says Miller's, quote, "interagency operations are invaluable to the FBI. That's what we talk about," end quote. We've examined this exact exchange in a previous episode, but it's worth restating here because Ross uses it as part of the same broader pattern she's building. Confirmed frequent contact with a senior political official, paired with a description that leaves the line between coordination and direction genuinely undefined. That gap isn't resolved in this hearing any more than it was in the earlier one. The 14-year vacancy figure, connected in one more time. Ross also brings up the vacancy timeline we've covered in a previous full episode, Patel's own confirmed figure of roughly 14 years to refill positions vacated during his tenure. She uses it here specifically to argue that the scale of departures goes well beyond normal turnover, connecting it directly back to her broader argument that personnel decisions haven't followed the standard he set for himself. Worth restating the fair counterpoint one more time, since it applies just as much here. Specialized federal law enforcement hiring genuinely requires extensive clearance and training pipelines, regardless of why any specific position became vacant. A long refill estimate is, at least partly, a real structural fact about how these jobs work, not automatically proof that an unusually large number of people were improperly terminated. Ross's closing line and what it actually is. Ross ends her questioning with a direct statement. "Director Patel, it is very clear that you have flunked your own test." She frames this as Patel prioritizing his own job security over doing what's right for the FBI and the American people. Worth being precise about what that statement actually is. It's Ross's own conclusion, drawn from the pattern of answers across this exchange, not a separate piece of evidence beyond what's already been discussed. Her framing is powerful, specifically because she never had to invent a standard to measure him against. She used his own written words, but the conclusion itself is her interpretation of what those answers add up to, not a new confirmed fact standing on its own. Okay, full fairness pass, everything today. All right, real pushback across the whole exchange. On the pronoun slip, genuinely a normal speech correction under live pressure, and treating it as more significant than that risks reading too much into an ordinary verbal stumble. On the people have been asked claim and the 5 election detail, this rests on the Driscoll complaint's own allegations, which remain untested in court. It's a serious claim worth taking seriously, but it hasn't been independently confirmed beyond the civil complaint itself. On the Driscoll termination letter, without seeing the complete unredacted letter, it's possible the Article 2 reference was one part of a broader stated justification rather than the sole cited authority. A hearing characterization of a document isn't necessarily the whole document. On the Miller conversations, frequent, substantial coordination between an FBI director and a senior White House policy official on genuinely interagency matters like Homeland Security task forces is a normal, long-standing feature of how the executive branch operates across administrations. Confirming contact isn't, by itself, evidence of improper direction. On the 14-year figure,
Real institutional hiring constraints exist independent of the underlying cause of any specific vacancy, and the long refill estimate doesn't automatically prove an improperly large wave of terminations. On Ross's closing conclusion, it's a legitimate reading of the pattern she built across her questioning time, but it remains her interpretation, and reasonable people reviewing the same exchange could weigh the individual pieces differently. What people who actually study this stuff say. Legislative procedure specialists note that using a witness's own prior written or sworn commitments as the measuring stick for later questioning is widely considered one of the more rigorous, harder to deflect oversight techniques available, because it doesn't require establishing a new standard, just testing an existing one the witness already agreed to. Employment law attorneys on the were the questions asked versus were the firings retaliatory distinction specifically note that these genuinely are separate legal inquiries requiring separate evidence. A court could find that inappropriate questions were asked during an interview process while still needing independent proof that any specific termination was actually motivated by the answers given, or vice versa. Federal ethics specialists on the Miller relationship reiterate that the coordination versus direction distinction is one of the harder lines to draw definitively from public testimony alone. It typically requires internal communications, the kind that would surface through discovery in active litigation, rather than characterizations offered in a hearing room. Real talk: why this specific hearing style actually matters. Beyond the specific claims, I think this hearing is worth remembering for the technique itself. Testing someone against their own prior stated standard, rather than an external accusation, is a genuinely useful way to evaluate anyone in a position of authority, a boss, an elected official, an institution. It removes the argument over whether the standard itself is fair, since the person being tested is the one who set it. That's a transferable way of thinking about accountability that applies well beyond this one hearing or this one director.
What to watch for next? Watch the Driscoll lawsuit's discovery process for whether the specific voting question allegation gets independent corroboration beyond the complaint itself. That would move this thread from allegation to confirmed fact directly. Watch for whether the unredacted termination letter, if it becomes part of the public court record, clarifies the Article 2 citation one way or the other. That's the whole exchange. Patel's own written words tested against his own later answers as fairly as I can lay it out. Subscribe if you want the next update the moment the Driscoll case produces real documents. Drop below, do you think testing an official against their own prior promises is the fairest kind of oversight questioning, or does it still leave too much room for interpretation? Talk soon.